You're watching Shooting USA, America's #1 source for firearms news and information.
Well, if ever there was a U.S. service rifle with a fascinating background, this is the one, the M1 Carbine. It was designed in part by David Carbine Williams, who served time in the pen for second-degree murder. Jimmy Stewart even starred in a 1950s movie as Carbine Williams. Well, after serving time, Williams couldn't own a gun, but he still got a job with Winchester Repeating Arms, putting his design skills to use. And the rest, as we say, is history's guns. Admired by some, denounced by others, the U.S. Carbine Caliber 30, better known as the M1 Carbine, is like a lot of things born in compromise. Almost no one thought it was perfect.
Basically what this gun was intended to do is to replace a pistol. So you've got a 30 caliber round, which is, approximately the same power as about a 38 Super, maybe a little more. Didn't have a lot of knockdown, but at close range it would do the job. So they got a little bit of a bad rap, but a lot of guys that carry these things all the way through World War II and even in Vietnam really liked them.
And Gary James is one of those guys who really likes the M1 Carbine, in spite of the mixed reviews it got in its day from soldiers and Marines. The U.S. adopted the M1 Carbine in 1942, shortly after the start of the Second World War. Winchester designed it, but many companies joined the wartime effort, building 6 million M1s by 1945.
It was made by a ton of different makers, some really fun makers. Other than normal Winchester, but then you had people like IBM, International Business Machine, Rockola, who made jukeboxes, to U.S. Postal Meter.
The carbine was never intended to serve as a frontline infantry weapon, but rather as a defensive rifle, primarily issued to troops in the rear, to officers, medics, radiomen, to support personnel in mortar, machine gun, and artillery units. Even soldiers backing up the flamethrowers carried the M1 Carbine.
Theoretically, the M1 Carbine was intended to replace the 45 1911 government model with support troops and cooks and people like that, but it ended up being very popular with troops in general, and a lot of officers carried them. So it ended up being pretty pervasive.
And while it certainly saw its share of action, especially in the South Pacific, no soldier will tell you that the M1 Carbine was close to a match for America's primary service rifle, the M1 Garand in 30-06.
No, there's no comparison between a 30 carbine and an M1 Garand. I mean, we're apples and oranges there. But the M1 Carbine, for what it's intended to do, was adequate.
Still, the carbine did get very good marks for durability, reliability, and its compact size and weight. At 5.5 pounds, it weighs about half of the larger M1 Garand. Firepower with a 15-round box magazine was also a plus for the carbine.
Really well-made little gun and really well designed. The big drawback it had was power, but then again, when you consider it was designed to replace a handgun, maybe that's not so unusual.
There are several variations of the carbine, among them the Select Fire M2. But two models are most important. The original M1 with full walnut stock, this one complete with mag pouch. And the M1A1 paratrooper model with its distinctive folding metal stock. It is the M1A1 that is now most prized by collectors like Gary James.
The problem was it's kind of heavy. When you've got this on here, and especially with the extra added mag pouches, sometimes they'd hit and these things would just tear right loose and they lose their firearms. But it's a pretty slick rig. You'll see the paratrooper version, the M1 Carbine, has a folding stock. These are highly desirable.
Desirable and rare. Of the 6 million M1 carbines produced, only 150,000 were the M1A1 paratrooper model.
This is pretty slick because this thing just folds right up and away you go. Even has a little oil bottle in here, and it's one of the most fun guns in the world to shoot. There's no question about it, and certainly has a tremendous amount of history.
Indeed it does. From the paratroopers who jumped into Normandy to our Marines on Iwo Jima, America even equipped its allies with M1 carbines to help drive Japan from the Philippines. The rifle saw action for more than 3 decades, going to war in Korea in the 50s and again in Vietnam. And even today, it is still admired.
I'll tell you one thing, it's probably one of the most fun guns in the world to shoot. It's one of my all-time favorites. I just love shooting M1 carbines.
Now, more carbine history. Picture this on the wall of an artillery school classroom in 1942, with privates fresh from boot camp learning the firearms they'll be issued. This field artillery training chart came from our friends at the Franklin Gun Shop. History framed, in case I forget how to field strip my M1 carbine.